In this episode, we meet 3 out of 9 panelists who are challenging the status quo in different cities across the U.S. A performing artist in Brooklyn, New York, who speaks out on the normalization of Black pain in the media.
Every American audience is addicted to images of Black pain.
A female program facilitator in a high-security, all-male prison in Southern California.
In the largest state in the nation with the most prisons, I have the only evidence-based self-help program in the system. That means we're pretty important.
And a mixed-race spoken-word artist who calls out racism in his communities in both North Carolina and Los Angeles.
When you point the finger at the system, it shows where the fault actually lies.
Each give their inside view from the front lines for Black Lives Matter as we explore politics, white supremacy, and cult psychology. Hi, I'm Cara Cruickshank. Welcome to Essential Stories, an independent Grassroots docuseries and live roundtable discussions that give voice to people on the front lines of our world's most pressing social issues. A graduate from the Juilliard School of Music, Jory Nance is using his work in the arts to help audiences build compassion as a tactic to dismantle white supremacy.
A big part of my work is building compassion. I find that lately a big piece of white supremacy is this notion of empathy, which does not spur us to action. It creates a guilt loop more than actually inciting action. Compassion creates action in my experience. My one-man show is entitled #Blame Justice. I primarily focused on violence against Black bodies. Starting in 2014 with Ferguson, I was so struck by the images and the way in which people would consume Black pain and how obsessed we were with empathy, but how bereft we were of compassion. I just was compelled to write. I started writing anytime I saw the expose of Black pain that was going on so constantly, 2014 through 2018. Just the images it was like the 90s all over again. It was just like constantly bombarded with images in the media of just bloody Black bodies. The piece Blame Justice was birthed as a response to that every American audience is addicted to images of Black pain. We're fed by it. It's kind of like leechsome almost. A big part of my work is building compassion and making sure that people are holding each other accountable.
In addition to keeping each other accountable, we need to keep ourselves accountable in terms of how we each contribute to systemic racism and white violence and how we resist it. We need to walk our talk and acknowledge as a critical mass that the most marginalized groups of people in this country have consistently been Black women, Indigenous women, Hispanic women, and trans women. The way violence against women of color is depicted is the next layer that needs to be addressed in dismantling white male supremacy in all forms of media. California has the highest recidivism rate for prisons in the U.S. Jen Abreu is a coordinator and facilitator for an educational and empowerment program for male high-security state prisoners. The program, Alternatives to Violence, was born out of the civil rights movement with a strong component of civil disobedience.
I'm working with a complete set of politics, white supremacy, and cult psychology inside this dynamic prison. Prison in itself is based upon white supremacy. It is. Even though the population is mostly Black and brown, the rules and the policies that are in place are white supremacist policies. And I'm able to be in a really unique position where I get to work with a bunch of really amazing human beings inside this facility. And they run this workshop. I show up with the materials and they do everything. My wheelhouse apparently seems to be in the general population yard, which we call the main line. That's where all the active gang members in prison are. I create a space for all of them to come together and work out communication differences, because at the end of the day, they realize it's them versus us. And that's super important to me. In the largest state in the nation with the most prisons, I have the only evidence-based self-help program in the system. That means we're pretty important. We not only help mitigate the violence in the prison yard, but we actually, is proven, if the men take my workshop, it decreases their odds of returning back to prison, right? There's actual data behind it. And California has the highest recidivism rate in the nation. And recidivism is the rate in which you return to prison. And in California, it's anywhere from 65 to 80%. So I stand inside of a prison yard and I'll stand up 10 men and I'll tell 7 of them, you guys are all coming back. That's the data. The curriculum is a collective works between the men that survived the Attica uprising in 1971 that were displaced all over the state of New York. And some of them ended up at Greenhaven facility. And they got together with the help of a man who was instrumental in desegregating the Jim Crow South with Stokely Carmichael and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And his name is Dr. Bernard Lafayette. And he was the one who actually trained the activists for the lunch counter protest sit-ins. And so he helped collaborate with the men from Attica. They came up with this curriculum on how to mitigate violence in the prison system. So the whole program came out of the civil rights movement, and it has a very strong component in civil disobedience. Believe it or not, this is what I'm doing inside of a prison yard. They allow this, y'all, right? And so the men are the ones that are, it was created for the prison population. It is facilitated by the prison population. They need me on the outside just to show up and be a consistent person for them and bring supplies and just be in there in that space. This program, like I said, it empirically works. Men go to parole board, and if this is not on their jacket, the parole board will literally say to them, you are denied. Don't come back here unless you have this on your paperwork. That's how important this is. I'm really honored to have the privilege to be able to work with this population.
The system has been intentionally rigged. Jen's work in connecting with and empowering men who have been branded as the worst of society to understand this system, how it works, and how to permanently remove themselves from it is crucial in the dismantling of white supremacy. Find me swinging at the sky and throwing kicks at pastors, whips for telling. Rhythm is a poet, rapper, and musician with a first-hand view on the contrasting flavors and layers of both systematic racism and cultural bigotry on the east and west coasts of America.
Systematic bigotry is different than actual bigotry because it's not my job to teach someone that they're being racist, and also it's not entirely their fault because it was the way that they were raised. And I feel like when you point the finger at the system, it shows where the fault actually lies, because I feel like the difference between it being systematic and it being just how you were raised, which also coincide, is that I often find if someone is leaning more into the systematic side of it, that person is a lot less open to being proven wrong. I didn't experience any firsthand police brutality until I moved from North Carolina to California. Because in North Carolina, I very often find that people are a lot more open to being called out on their racism and will have a yelling, screaming match with you where you fist fight a person and then you figure it out. But I feel like out here, because it's so often more systematic, because it's a big metropolitan area, that when you bring these topics up to people, the actual system of it gives people ways to divert attention from what the actual problem is. It gives them these catchphrases that they can use to just continue to perpetuate the cycle, because it's like sophism. If you learn sophism, it's learning to win the argument for the sake of winning the argument. Just because you don't have the exact words to explain to someone why they're wrong doesn't mean they're not wrong. You can explain your argument logically all day, still be racist.
I feel like I have a very privileged perspective through being mixed and being raised the way I am, because I grew up in North Carolina around Fort Bragg, and I often find that in these matters, I do, just from growing up around soldiers, have a tendency to be a lot more militant than most people and allow a lot less slack. I often find it a lot easier to call out a right-wing person on their racism than a left-wing person.
I feel like they're so much sooner ready to have the argument and actually butt heads and accept the fact that they were wrong. And it's a weird tightrope to walk. I'd rather just call someone out and then we just go from there instead of having to walk on eggshells and hope that they get it.
In our next episode, we will meet 3 more influential panelists who are building the bridges and being the change. A Black female rapper from Alabama writing words to re-educate the public on Black power, a pro-Palestinian Israeli immigrant in Boulder, Colorado, who specializes in cult psychology, and a Pan-African award-winning slam poet in Denver who went undercover for 8 months as a white supremacist online. How have you experienced systemic racism? Let us know in the comments below. These are real people, real stories, real experiences.